Welcome to Social Personality Development, Unit 6. In this unit, we'll be talking about the self. To get started, we have to try and define what we mean by the self. And this is really tricky. Most sources actually have a lot of difficulty with this, and the way researchers have examined the self have come from lots of different disciplines, such as social anthropology, social work, philosophy, and psychology. And depending on what avenue they're coming from, they define the self in very different ways. For instance, we know that there is at least 5 different components of the self, and we can see them here in the bright yellow bubbles. So they are the self, our self-concept, also known as our self-representation, our social reputation or social identity, our personal narrative, and our self-evaluation, also known as self-competence, also known as self-esteem. So there's a lot of self stuff happening right now. We're going to launch into each one of these 5 bright bubbles, and then we'll go into depth with each of the developmental stages in the more dimly lit bubble down in the far right corner. So let's start off by talking briefly about what we mean by the first one, just simply titled the self. So the self is usually the term taken from philosophy and just understanding that you exist, that you are someone. And so this is your subjective self-awareness that you are here. The sense that you have a boundary, there's somewhere where you stop and the rest of the world begins. We know that this is not automatic. This is something that develops in infancy. For instance, infants start off believing that they are completely the same as their moms and as the environment around them. If you think about the way our neurological development starts, it's the idea that our brain is here, and how do we know our hands are us or our hands are something else? What can we control? And it's only through neurological development and gross motor development, fine motor development, that we begin to understand what we have direct control over and what we have more indirect control over in our environment. And we start to understand what is the boundary of our self. So the self is the cognitive representation of what you are. And it's the idea that you have a viewpoint, you have a worldview, you have a framework with you are viewing your daily experiences in that other people are not viewing. So this is something that develops later on in cognitive development, especially around theory of mind, around age 5, where kids start to understand that their viewpoint can be very different from other people's viewpoints, even when they're looking at the same thing or the same scenario. So the self is probably one of the hardest for us to test in developmental psychology. We can attempt to test how they represent their own thoughts or how they represent other people's thoughts, but that may not be exactly the same as their sense of self. So this is something that we more so look at through the lens of philosophy, but it is still a very important area. The next one we're going to talk about, it does get a little bit more attention in psychology, and this one is considered your self-concept or your self-representation. And you notice for this unit, I'm using a lot of bubbles, a lot of little circles. And the way I like to think about this is a 3-dimensional sphere where we simply place everything that we consider is part of our identity. And for each individual person, this is going to be a different size. And some people might have a very broad and complex self-concept or self-representation, and some people may have a more small or finite or focused self-representation or self-concept. But some of the possible things that may be included in a person's self-concept would be things like their name, their age, their nationality, their ethnicity, their religion, their sexuality, their hobbies, their career, their relationships, if they live in a city or if they live in a rural area. It's the ideas of what makes you. So if you think about perhaps if you're collecting badges or if you're collecting buttons to put on your knapsack, what are the things that are going to feel like they represent you? And we can kind of see there's a little bit of my self-concept or self-representation behind me here in the table. I have a brain representing psychology, and I also have Uncle Iroh representing Avatar: The Last Airbender series. So there's a little bit of stuff going on there. I also have the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles too. And so there's a little bit of what would go into my self-concept. So it can definitely include fandoms and your favorite music and your favorite movies or sports, anything that really locks into you. So your self-concept is sort of what's inside the bubble. It's the stuff you know about yourself. It's going to be conscious stuff, not unconscious stuff. And so it's your internal view and the way you describe yourself, or if you are making small talk with a person and they bring up something, do you identify with that? So this may include things like your school colors, if you're really proud of the school you belong to, if you have a lot of school spirit, it could also be that. So it's the core concepts that you think make up you and your identity. And when you self-reflect, you're able to tap into all of these things. That being said, if you're not sure if something fits into your self-concept or doesn't, there is a scientific way we can test that, and that's through examining your SelfSchemata. So a SelfSchemata is the idea that if something is truly within your bubble of self-representation or self-concept, you are going to process it differently at a neurological level. Things that are inside your bubble have a difference in terms of how quickly we process the information about those things. If you're trying to make decisions, we can test this scientifically through personality questionnaires and Likert surveys. And it's the idea that if we ask someone their opinions, whether they strongly disliked or strongly liked something, if it fits in their bubble, it doesn't matter if they like it or dislike it, it might be in their bubble because they don't like it, they will be able to answer the questions faster. We can process the information more efficiently and more quickly if it fits in your bubble. So it's the idea that if you really like knitting and somebody asks you, do you like knitting? Yes, that's an easy answer. Versus, do you like cricket? You might be slower to answer if you like cricket because you've never really considered it. It might be the ones that you hit neutral, but we find when you go to hit neutral on a Likert survey, it does take us more time. Even if it's measured in half seconds, it does take us more time. We also find that things that are truly in your self-concept, when it comes to measuring this self-schemata, we have cognitive biases towards those things. And it's the idea that we pay more attention to them. If you think about the cocktail party effect, the cocktail party effect that you can pick up on conversations across the room doesn't just apply when they say your name, but also when they say anything that's within your self-schemata or your self-concept or your self-representation. So if we can process them and pay attention to them and pick up on them when we're inattentive, this is the idea that our brain uses them as really special cues. In addition to attention biases, we also see interpretation biases. This is the idea that if you're in sort of an ambiguous, vague scenario, but something within your self-concept is affiliated, you're going to interpret things possibly different than what the average person would interpret if they don't have that in their self-schemata. So if there's a news article about something happening in Nova Scotia, and most people would gloss over it and think about it in one type of way, a person from Nova Scotia may really pick up on details and may interpret it and may feel quite differently about that scenario than someone who's not familiar with Nova Scotia. Finally, we have response biases. And this is the idea that if somebody offers you something, or would you like to avoid this, or would you like to engage with this, you're going to choose something differently based on what's in your self-concept. So this is the idea that if you're Canadian and somebody asks you, do you like maple syrup? You're going to know right away whether or not you like maple syrup. You're going to pay attention when people talk about maple syrup, and you're going to respond in a way that's much more elevated. So I'm a Canadian who likes maple syrup. I'm going to tell them right away, I love maple syrup. I celebrate Maple Syrup Day on February 6th every year. And so this is something I'm going to enjoy. Versus somebody says, do you like snow? That's still in my self-schemata because I'm Canadian, but I don't like snow. So although I dislike winter and I dislike snow, and I have to be around it a lot because I live in a very snowy area, it's the idea that I'm going to be quick to respond and say, oh, I really don't like snow. The first snowfall, I'm ready to go into hibernation mode. And my response is much more stronger than someone who's not familiar with snow. Now compare that to a flamingo. I don't know much about flamingos. I saw them once when I was on vacation. I've seen them before at zoos, but I don't have strong feelings about flamingos. And one of the reasons I don't have strong feelings about flamingos is because they're not in my self-concept. I could give or take them. I'm pretty neutral towards flamingos. And so this is the idea, it doesn't fit in my self-concept, doesn't connect with me anywhere. And if somebody asks me about it, I honestly don't know. And I still don't know even after putting them in this slide. I guess they're okay. They're not the most interesting bird to me, but I don't dislike them. And if somebody asked me if I wanted to go see flamingos, I would have to say, well, what else is there to do? The flamingos are not something that makes me upset like snow, and not something that makes me happy like maple syrup. It's just sort of benign. So we can see that what's in your self-concept, you're going to have these stronger feelings towards, you're going to process the information quickly, you're going to pay more attention, interpret scenarios involving things in your self-concept differently, and respond more quickly and more strongly towards them, whether it's in the positive or in the negative. So we know that things that are within your self-concept or within your self-representation, we process differently because they're also in our self-schemata. Schemata is the cognitive idea that we have an idea about these things and therefore it can go more quickly. So do things within our self-concept or representation change over time? Well, it's a little bit complicated. We actually find that our self-concept is very stable. When something gets added to our core identity, it's not something flaky like the flavor of the week. It's not our weekly obsession or interest. It has to be something that's really sustaining over time, that we really like for a duration of months or years. And so because of that, the things that really fit in our core bubble are going to be things that are more permanent, like our name, our ethnicity, where we grew up, things that really shaped our worldview in our formative years in childhood. That being said, our self-concept can change, and some of the ways that it can change is especially through adolescence. We know Erik Erikson was a big proponent of experimenting with one's identity, experimenting with one's self-concept during adolescence. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but that is a time in our life where it can really change. Another time it can really change is when our life is really changing. If you are getting married, if you're becoming a parent, if you're getting divorced, if you're retiring, if you're getting a job promotion, if you land into a lot of money or you lose a lot of money, if you become disabled, if you are grieving, those are the things that can really shake up and change our self-concept. Now, in addition to these very core permanent things, it's the idea that even if they are pretty permanent, we can work to change them if there's something different. It's never too late to start a new hobby and make a big change in one's life. You could always start a new thing or change career choices anytime in your life. However, we do find people differ in how permanent they view their self-concept. Some individuals with a more fixed mindset tend to believe that everything that's in their self-concept and who they are cannot change. And other people have a growth mindset. This is the idea that if they work hard enough, they could always add new things or remove the things they don't like from their self-concept. This can really have diverse effects depending on what's going on with the person. This can really come into play if we think about an example like a survivor of abuse. Someone who has survived abuse but has a very fixed mindset towards their self-concept, they may believe that this survival of abuse is core to their identity and it's going to be on the main stage of their identity for the rest of their life. And this might be what really defines them as a victim of abuse. Versus a survivor might say, look, that's part of me, but there's so much more that's part of me. And I can grow in all these new ways, and I don't need that one experience to define me. So we can see there how growth mindset might be very beneficial. Another example is the idea of addictions. We may have someone who is struggling with mental illness or struggling with addictions, and they may have a fixed mindset. And they may believe, I'm never going to get over this. I'll never be able to change. Or if they have emotion regulation issues, or if they don't have the best people skills, they may say, I can't get better. I can't get over this. Versus if they have a growth mindset, it might be the idea that, hey, I can work on this and eventually change my self-concept. If you think back to high school, it's possible that who you were as a secondary student, you might have had a fixed mindset saying, oh, the way my life right now is during high school is the way it'll always be. That's something to take in mind when we're dealing with the pandemic right now during coronavirus. And this is the idea that what is happening right now is not the way things will always be. This is temporary and things can change. So to wrap this up, we know that our self-concept is fairly stable, and it tends to be the more enduring components of ourselves that make it into our self-concept. But that being said, we can change it if we work at it through both major life changes and through conscious changes of trying to adjust ourselves.